All right, so we've talked a little bit about FirstNet. So the creation of FirstNet occurred with the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act. You probably have heard that a dozen times now. Really quickly, what it did in the creation of that bill, the main thing is that public safety had lobbied to try to build out this network for years. And so it was finally the success of public safety coming together with a single voice and getting a network started for public safety. So it awarded that D block of spectrum that I showed on that spectrum chart. So that chunk of spectrum that was kind of just held there, trying to figure out what to do with it, was awarded to public safety, dedicated to them. It created FirstNet, the First Responder Network, which is an independent authority under NTA and Department of Commerce as the responsible entity for building and managing this network. It required a nationwide approach for the build out of this network, and in doing that, the license for the spectrum nationwide was given to FirstNet, so they managed the spectrum for the build of the network. It funded a total of, it allocated $7 billion of funding for this network, $2 billion of which were kind of given up front as a loan to get started on the activity as well. More spectrum is auctioned off to generate revenue to eventually fully fund that $7 billion. It allocated separately $135 million into a grant program, the State and Local Implementation Grant Program, or commonly referred to as SLICP. So that's the grant that is helping the states do these planning activities. And it also specified an opt-in or opt-out provision, which we'll talk a bit more in detail, so that that the states have the ability to accept the FirstNet plan or opt out and develop their own plan. Quick chart of the funding, just to show how this looks like. So as I mentioned, $7 billion total. $2 billion is given up front to help start kind of these planning activities that we're in now. Eventually, that same $7 billion and a big part of that $2 billion will be used for the implementation and the build-out of that network. And once that $7 billion is gone in the build-out of this network, it's required by law to be a self-sustaining network. So the business model has to make sure that whatever is built out, that it's going to be self-sustaining into the future. So there are several ways that were identified in the law of how that can be done. So first and foremost, there's going to be, like the user fees, just like you pay today with commercial services. So some type of user fee to use or access the network. You've also may have heard that the spectrum that they have is a very hot commodity. It's a very valued piece of spectrum. And so the public safety network with the limited users of public safety may not potentially use all that capacity on the network, certainly maybe not during day-to-day activities. So they're looking at ways that they can lease out some of that excess spectrum and generate more revenue from that as well to maybe some of the commercial carriers that could use some of that spectrum for the build-out of their networks. And then finally, just the lease of any network, equipment, sites, backhaul that is built out by FirstNet, they can lease that out as well. So those are all different ways that the network can generate revenue for sustainment and continued development of the network. This was FirstNet's approved budget for FY14, approved by the board in August. And really what it does is it shows kind of where the focus areas are for this upcoming year. You can see it's a total of $194 million, so quite a bit of funding that was allocated or approved. Some of the biggest areas you can see right through the middle here are state consultation and the development of these network plans, state network plans. So this consultation process is going to drive ultimately the development of these network plans. And you can see that's a big area of the funding for FirstNet, what they're focused on. They're starting on the core network. As I mentioned, it's FirstNet's responsibility to develop the core, no matter if states opt in or opt out. They have significant investment getting started. There's some early mover projects you may have, like the LA RICS or the Adams County, Harris County. Some of those early builders or early movers, areas that were building out projects with some grant money that they had gotten, and so they're working with them to gain access to the spectrum, since FirstNet is now the license holder, and then figure out how those can kind of be good lessons learned and integrate into the network later on. And then obviously there's some investment in devices today, and then just building up the company, making sure they're standing up an organization to be basically the 5th largest nationwide carrier in the country. So that takes a fair amount of work to do as well. Responsibilities of FirstNet per the law. So this is important because this is what FirstNet must do as prescribed by the law. It doesn't mean that FirstNet's not going to do many other things in this process, but these are definitely ones that have to be addressed in the law. So they have to do state consultation and work with the states to develop what those state plans are being. Frankly, that's the desire, because you as the potential users, they want to know what the state's needs are to build out those state plans. They'll be responsible for management of the network, so everything from the contracts and building up the program office. Standards, so that's why they've already teamed with the PSCR, Public Safety Communications Research Group, and ensuring that public safety has a voice in those standards, and also that standards are met for the build of this network, that they're following whatever release or the current release of standards are. Certified equipment list, any device that goes onto this network must be certified, and FirstNet will define what that certification process looks like, but it won't just be any device can just get on the network without going through some type of certification process. Generating RFPs for the network, that process has already started. They've released and received feedback on several RFIs, so in the very early stages of that. Commercial infrastructure, so there's a responsibility here for FirstNet to build this network out as efficiently as possible. So leveraging any existing infrastructure, whether it's state, local, federal, tribal, private, commercial, they're going to look at all possible ways to build up this network as effectively and cost effectively as possible. Cybersecurity is a big one. That's, obviously there's some unique requirements for public safety on our networks and making sure the networks are secure, so that's been a big focus area. Integrating PSAPs, and rural is a big one too that's unique, where the law wanted to make sure that the network was going to serve both big city areas but also rural. So they need to develop some rural milestones of how they plan to roll out this network to support the rural communities, not just the major cities. And you notice the one thing the law says that they cannot do is they cannot sell directly to consumers. So this network, it will be to support public safety users, not to just the general public. So FirstNet stood up a board of directors. The board of directors is a board of 15 people. The first 3 are permanent members. You can see at the top here the Secretary of DHS, Attorney General, and the Director of OMB. The remaining 12 are appointed by NTIA, and they have to have minimally 3 public safety professionals on the board and at least 3 representatives representing state, local, and tribal. And they want a diverse background of whether it's technical, financial, or business side of it. So you can see here's the board. They do have 4 public safety members representing the major 3 disciplines, and you can see there's quite a few others that have come from a wide variety of backgrounds. A very diverse board. I think it's been very effective at of blending the commercial and the public safety groups together so far. The program office is being set up in FirstNet, so Bill DiAgostino is the general manager, appointed last summer. The deputy general manager is T.J. Kennedy, and so you probably have seen Bill and T.J.'s name mentioned several times. They're still building out the rest of the team here. Several of these positions actually have been filled here in the program office, and then they're also hiring out positions underneath with each one of these. And you can kind of see what the different responsibilities would be within each of the branches of the office. So FirstNet is going to organize very similar to how FEMA and DHS organize today. We're going to group by, just for kind of some of the outreach and education and immediate interface with the state. So they've decided to break into the FEMA regions, have representatives within each FEMA region. So you'll have a FirstNet regional person that you will work with, potentially in addition to a state point of contact. They also are going to identify dedicated members to support federal engagements, federal interaction, as well as tribal. Understanding that we know the law stated that tribal representation would go through the state point of contact. That is typically not, obviously, how tribal nations as sovereign nations operate. They are sovereign nations. So That's why they're still understanding some of the, the limitations of the law. They want to make sure that they have ways that they can engage tribal. It doesn't mean that within the states, you certainly can't, continue to work with your tribal constituents. But FirstNet will also have dedicated members there to support tribal as well as federal engagement. So a lot of times there's been questions of who engages the federal agencies within the state. And the response from FirstNet has been basically, if you have existing relationships within the state, they're working within some of your governing bodies, then by all means continue to work with those groups. But don't feel like it's the state's responsibility to engage all federal agencies within the state. They will be doing that through what's called the AZPSBN, the Emergency Communications Preparedness Council. It's a council that represents the major federal organizations, so they've already started engagement there to work at the headquarters level down. But certainly, as I said, the local levels and the relationships you've already built, sometimes that's a good way to get input as well. Any questions so far? Yes.
Hey, just kind of as an agency, take me through, if you can, today I'm a customer of Verizon using their data services.
Right.
So when this comes, what kind of is the main differences I'm going to see? Because I'll go to a Verizon rep and I'll go to their technical support, I'll get things. What changes am I going to see when FirstNet comes to the door?
Right, so great question. And for those on the phone, the question is basically just how would this differ from how you would get your services today through a Verizon or commercial carrier? So it's really going to be, a very similar model just from the standpoint of billing and getting some of those services. You'll get devices from them just like you would today. Provisioning will be a little bit different, obviously, because it's a controlled access network, so it's not like this anyone could walk into the FirstNet store and buy your device or however that will work.
So you're saying that I get my devices where?
You would get them through FirstNet, so they will be, yeah.
So you're pretty much, like I said, you're going to be like, instead of I'm going to Verizon, I'm going to you for the same thing.
Exactly. So right, not me. So I'm DHS, Office of Emergency Communications, but yes.
I put your name.
I will not be your FirstNet representative now for procuring devices. But yeah, so it'll be, like I said, I mean, some ways to look at it, and I've heard it mentioned recently, is it's going to be the fifth nationwide carrier behind the big four, and so it'll look from some instances very similar to that, where you go and you get your devices, you get your service, you get your monthly bill, you're paying your monthly bill. Some of the differences, though, will obviously be just the controlled access to the network, some of the potential prioritization and added uniqueness or capabilities that the network would have that you may not get on the commercial sector. So, prioritization is a big one. I'll talk a little bit more, too, about just some of the, access to network operations or network maintenance or network monitoring. That type of potential is there.
Just a follow-up question.
Yeah.
So, am I going to necessarily need additional resources or budget in order to support this?
So, another good question. Would you need additional?
Are you taking something away that I got to fill in somewhere else? Or
correct.
You're going to pay me so much money that I can hire a couple?
So the primary target of this initially is to really replace whatever you're using today for commercial data services, because now you've got the benefit if it's a controlled network, it's added redundancy, reliability, some of those factors. But they also recognize, FirstNet has been told many times over that the costs will have to be very competitive to what users pay for their commercial services today, because they're getting by, they're making, you've built operational procedures around how you use those networks today, and so you're making good use of them. And to think that you're going to go on to this, just automatically move over to a new network that's maybe twice the cost, for example, or 50% increase, is not feasible, and it's not required by anyone. So this would really just be, it would be FirstNet service becomes available. If you're compelled to go use that service, then you would migrate all of your commercial services over to them, use their devices, use their network, start paying and going through just like you would today with your commercial services. They would be your new service provider, basically. Make sense? Yeah, good question. Any other questions so far? I've been cruising through. All right, so moving on then. So in the law, it also stood up a Public Safety Advisory Committee. So this was the committee that was going to advise the board on specific public safety requirements. So it consists of 41 members. It has an executive committee. Chief Harlan McEwen chairs that executive committee and the board. And they've been working with FirstNet very closely and have a handful of initiatives that they're working on and providing input and feedback to the board. And you can see them there, some pretty important ones on public safety grade, identity management. There's just going to be some of the unique requirements of this network that this group is tackling so far. The FirstNet WonderPro. So this slide has been briefed many times by FirstNet, so we're just taking this to kind of help illustrate the approach, the thought process behind. So FirstNet recognizes that public safety operates has jurisdiction throughout the entire country, and that the feasibility of building out a terrestrial network just isn't cost effective. So you certainly are going to target the build out of the terrestrial network, called the fixed sites, the RAN, right, where you have the majority of users, the majority of operations. And that could be multiple networks. It could be the FirstNet network. They could strike roaming agreements or have partnerships with other carriers, and so you've got potentially multiple networks, terrestrial networks you could fall back onto, much like the big carriers do today, where they work with local, smaller regional carriers that so you kind of roam onto their networks. That where you don't have coverage for terrestrial networks, they're looking at a satellite kind of overlay to provide connectivity, and that can be done in a couple of different ways. It can be done where that you may have a device in your particular vehicle that talks LTE first and maybe satellite second. So if you fall outside of the coverage footprint of this terrestrial system, then you move on to that satellite system. So you still retain coverage. And a good example is, the highway patrol that have big area to patrol. Their jurisdiction is huge, and they might be out where there's just, you run outside of coverage of terrestrial networks. And if their devices are equipped, they could potentially migrate onto the satellite system and maintain some level of connectivity. And I know there's many challenges to that. Moving from one terrestrial network to a very different network over satellite, bandwidth restraints, costing model. There's a lot of challenges, but there's a lot of work going on in that area as well. So that's what that's kind of the vision of looking into. If you're equipped, then that's a service or option you want to have, that you can have that fallback. Yes.
Would that be running over a commercial satellite network, or are you Constellation satellite?
Yeah, that would be partnering with an existing commercial satellite system, yeah, vendor. So that would be using, timer circuits on some commercial satellite system. What's that?
So a possibility could be like the new Iranian constellation that they're putting up.
Yeah, it's an example. I mean, that's right. So there's a lot of new satellite technology going up, and that's actually, I think, why this looks somewhat promising, because there's a lot more technology advancement, smaller form factor antennas, on the move technology, a lot of more competition. But yeah, it would be they're not going to try to put up their own system. But that satellite system then could also be leveraged for deployable systems as well, just like we have often today, where you have some type of deployable cell on wheels or site on wheels or mobile comm vehicle, and it has satellite connectivity, and then it would just put up like a LTE bubble around the vehicle. So users, and so maybe it goes to a high spot or it's at some remote location, and everyone else is there with just their normal LTE handset or device. They would connect into that deployable system, and that deployable system would then be the one that connects back over satellite back into the network, providing connectivity. So that's a big one for when we look at our maps later on. And if you have really remote areas of the state where it just doesn't make sense potentially to have terrestrial coverage or build out terrestrial coverage, this would be the solution that could be deployed when coverage is needed in those areas. So any other questions on that? Okay. So the overall solution that FirstNet has recognized that they're not looking at this being like another data pipe where you unplug your USB modem and you plug in a new one and you just have a data pipe access. They're really targeting a complete solution. And this kind of gets back to your question about what I get with FirstNet over or differently from what I would get from my commercial providers today. So certainly the basic communications that you would get, just voice calls and about messaging and typical data applications. They're looking at applications. How could they support different applications? Would it be a FirstNet storefront? Would it be when you get your FirstNet device, maybe a base set of applications come with it? They're exploring different options there, but they certainly are looking into how applications will be supported on the network and how there would be FirstNet kind of supported applications, in addition to all the applications that you would normally want to run on the network that you have today. Different services related to public safety needs, so for data storage, record management, that could be something that maybe they've got a big warehouse or data facilities, and you as part of your FirstNet service, you get some of these services as well that go with it. And then just some of the unique capabilities that this network will offer. So certainly the ability to see into the health and the status of the network and see where users are, that will be, I think, a distinctive advantage of something like this that you wouldn't have necessarily over your commercial network. Provisioning and activation, that control the network, you get to decide who goes on, who doesn't, or just the fact that there'll be a limited user set, compared to commercial where everyone comes on. And then additionally, with that user base that comes on, there'll be, certain levels of priority on the network. And then there's also been a lot of talk about dynamic priority as well. So depending on if there's a specific event or specific users or a certain type of application, maybe streaming video is very important for a certain event, and maybe not normally. This ability to dynamically change the priorities of the network to support whatever the missions are something that you won't get in your commercial network today. Commercial networks today, everyone is equal. It's all best effort traffic. There's no priority to quality of service on the LTE networks today. Now that might change as voice and stuff are added, but it's not done today. So that's something that definitely would be unique to public safety network, FirstNet. All right, so we keep moving here. Consultation. So the law stated that FirstNet is to work with a single point of contact in every state, and that single point of contact will be the representative, can represent a body, but that will be the interface between FirstNet and the state. And part of that consultation required in the law is to do these things. So the construction of the core and the RAN build-out. So even though I said, the core is FirstNet's responsibility, they're still going to work with the state on where that is, how that works, what the connectivity looks like. Certainly where the RAN is built out, the placement of towers, because that drives coverage. The states will know best where they need coverage, how they need coverage, what type of coverage they need. So that's definitely a key component of consultation. We'll talk a little bit more about that today. That drives the coverage area of the network, but different levels of coverage as well. Where do you need in-building coverage versus vehicular coverage is good enough. Some of the uniqueness of this network obviously are that it's public safety grade. So what are some of the requirements for hardening, security, reliability, resiliency? All those will be discussion topics. Priority of users, that's a big one, but that's probably something that will come later in the process. User selection, and then ultimately training. So these are the things required by law to be covered in consultation. I do know that, we've worked very closely with FirstNet, that there's a lot of, and there's, as you know, working with it, there's a lot of other things that are being discussed and will likely be included in this consultation process, but these are the ones that are required by the law. And then SLIG-P, that's the grant program that we've mentioned that was, is there to support the states to support this interaction, this consultation. So, because that's one of the areas required, that's one of the reasons why we're talking about this today is an allowable activity under SLIG-P, and it's one of the things that's going to drive a lot of other activities in this process. So knowing where your coverage is a key component and one that will be discussed early in the process. So we've added a few of the new slides that were presented by FirstNet, trying to kind of further define this consultation process for you. So at the end of the day, when this consultation process ends, it culminates in a state plan, and that state plan will identify what will the FirstNet build-out look like potentially in the state of Arizona. It'll include inputs, from state, local, tribal, regional, rural, metro, all these these are the representatives required to participate in this per the law. So there's also, though, we know there's going to be inputs we already talked about from the federal side, and where they would potentially respond because they're a viable user base potentially for this network. And then there's also going to be just identifying all those existing assets that aren't necessarily supported here. That will be done by FirstNet as well, but will be fed up in this plan. So a couple of things we're trying to show here is that, one, your responsibility lies here. FirstNet will work these areas, but it'll still get incorporated in the state plan so you can see it. You can see what they've found, but that's not your responsibility. So you don't need to worry about going out to all the NGOs, all the private utilities necessarily, and gathering, or the commercial, tower companies. They will work that information. It's not to say that you couldn't help them work that in your state, but it's not necessarily your responsibility. Your responsibility lies here. All that information is rolled up into a state plan, is delivered for the governor to make the decision, hopefully, if they want to accept the state plan or opt out and try to develop their own state plan. So just a few of the principles for consultation. This is it's definitely going to be an iterative, active process. This is not something that they're looking to, that FirstNet's looking to kind of push information to you, receive it back, go off, do their thing, come back with a state plan. They are looking at several meetings, a lot of engagement, a lot of dialogue. They want to make sure that they've captured the state inputs, the state requirements in developing and building out the state plan. Early in the process, they will do, the message has been received loud and clear. The states want to know what their roles and responsibilities are and kind of what the big plan is so they can plan accordingly. So they're working on their best to identify, what is their responsibility, what will be your responsibility, what will we do together so that states can plan accordingly. FirstNet fully recognizes that there's a lot of work that could be done. There's a lot of data that could be collected. There's a lot of nice-to-have information. Frankly, there's just not enough time and money in the grant to gather all that. So they're really going to be focused on identifying what is minimally essential to develop this plan, to lighten the burden on the state so that you don't have to go out and collect information that's kind of nice to have. And they will also do their best to gather up what they have and provide to the states for you to review, comment on. That's like we're doing today. So whatever they can gather and present to you to provide, that they will do their best to try to really minimize that burden on the states. I mentioned, iterative, active process, and at the end of the day, the state plan will be delivered to the state. And as I've said multiple times, hopefully by the time the final state plan is delivered and is presented up to the governor, there will be nothing new in that. It will be something that you've all seen many times, you've worked together in developing, and it will just be a matter of formality at that point. So at a very high level, there's going to be a couple of key areas going on in this process. So once consultation starts with this initial meeting, it's going to kind of separate into two tracks here. There's going to be kind of the technical design track, and then you're also going to have kind of that more operational or business planning side. So knowing your users, costing, some of the different requirements that drive the operational and business side of it. And then you've got some of the requirements of where you're building this network out. And then those things, obviously there's give and take between those. So those will go into the asset selection identification and how these two relate. So as this process goes on in these parallel tracks and you're doing this kind of together with FirstNet, you're doing this interactive process. And eventually, you'll get results. You'll have your ultimate design, you'll have your ultimate business plan, the operational components, they'll all be brought together into the state plan. So the state plan is not just going to be here's your coverage design for the network, take it or leave it. It's going to cover, the operational side of it, the business side of it, as well as the technical design side of it. All right, so initial consultation. We're just going to kind of jump into each of these really quick and break them down a little bit more. So we know that initial consultation, they definitely want to focus on users, identifying users. Who are your users, potentially? No one's committing to anything at this point. How many do you have? Where do they operate? how many potential devices do they have? Because that's really ultimately at the end of the day, you're paying for devices, you're not paying for users. So, I'm sorry, there will be a big discussion around users of that initial consultation, one of the big things that they need to know. There'll also be a discussion around coverage. That's why we're having this workshop today. So the initial consultation will be heavy on coverage. We'll talk about roles and responsibilities and planning, and then messaging and outreach. Everyone knows that this is a huge effort to try to really get the word out doing messaging and outreach. In fact, I think the SLIG-P grant, it was overwhelmingly, this was the messaging and outreach was the biggest investment by the states. So FirstNet wants to make sure that they will help provide, resources, materials that can help with your messaging and outreach, talk to you about the strategy or plan, so that, it's hopefully they know what you're intending to do. They can serve you with the resources you need, that the messaging that FirstNet has, working with the states is, clear, hopefully, and consistent throughout multiple states and all the constituents involved. And again, one of the principles, as I mentioned before, that they're always going to try to provide as much information as they can up front to allow you to comment and response rather than kind of having to start from a clean slate. Asset identification. So this is still always a big question of how are you going to identify assets, where are they coming from, when will this process take place. So this is definitely the next step in the process. And they will definitely, provide guidance and methodologies and the tools required to do that. But really, they're showing here is that there's a lot of assets that are potentially available for use. But there's a lot of considerations to make before you get down to the assets that will be most ideal to use for the network. So, are they in the right location? Do they have they met the right hardening requirements for the public safety grade? What does access and operations look like on them? Legal? How does the title to them look? What is the cost? A lot of considerations that will go into this asset selection process. And really the goal here, though, is for SLIG-P Phase 2, so SLIG-P is broken into two phases. Phase 1 is a lot of the activities going on right now, outreach, education, identifying users. Phase 2 is really focused on identifying state assets that can be brought to bear to leverage by FirstNet. So that hasn't started yet. That before it gets started, it will be approved.
Nobody's asked any questions on this, but I know you just said state assets. Are you talking about state assets, including local jurisdictional assets as well as tribal assets?
Absolutely. State, local, tribal, yes. Yes. So anything within the state.
Within the state.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
Going back to that, any asset that
You're not used to me being this quiet, so now everybody's looking
no.
at me. Sorry.
No, I'm glad you had the question. So, yeah, any asset that's available that could be leveraged to build up the network, there's a lot of considerations they'll make on it, but they want to kind of know all possibilities so that they can do things smartly.
What's the incentive for the locals to include their asset and be considered as part of the program?
Pay for the use of that asset. So that they're looking at different ways. That hasn't been decided. There's been a lot of proposed ideas, but if they're going to come use that asset, there would be compensation for that, just like there would be on a commercial site.
I have a question from Michael Holmes on the, you might want to look at chat. Actually threw one out through chat, but wants to know if it's going to be CGIS compliant and what are the security aspects of the network?
Yeah, thanks. I don't have a good view of the chat window here, so yes, they have cybersecurity. We talked a little bit about it as a huge consideration. They recognize that to use this network, that users will want to use their typical applications that they use today. So they've already looked into CGIS, all the security requirements for running, law enforcement, federal, local, state applications, and so that's definitely be taken into consideration and will be compliant so that those services can be run on the network. Good questions. Any other questions? All right. Did you just get a text on that?
Yeah, I did.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. I don't know how we look at the chat window. Figure not, yeah. So I guess for the users on the phone, if you have a question, feel free, please, just to jump in. Yeah. think the best way for examples like that is if you want to gain access to those databases through this network, it would work much like you do today, and however you're gaining access. So if you're gaining access to those through the internet, and you have your security provisions set up for people to gain access to it, it would be much the same, where you would just be, you'd be connected into this network differently. So it's a different way to do it. So.
No one else will open an access to we have just an issue about this and then open pages and all that stuff. So all these databases with different tables, all of it, and have your whole data you're seeing. The deal is that FirstNet holds up. It's just another transfer of the network. It still goes on for you.
We don't need to worry about developing currently of software applications with
I don't believe so.
Part of the NPSBN statement of requirements was specifically to allow for access to home networks for users and to VPN into their home system. So that has been woven into the requirements for FirstNet to follow.
So you're learning.
Yeah, connecting to the network won't, just kind of automatically open it up to all potential people. They'll still have you'll still have the ability to secure things the same way you've done in the past. But certainly, you want to make sure that there's connectivity into it somehow. So whatever that connectivity is, whether it's just if you have some specific dedicated connectivity used today, you want to make sure that it gets rolled over. If it's just connecting to the internet using VPN access over it, that can be supported as well. Good question. Any other questions before we continue on? All right. So asset selection was very important, and will be coming down the path. It'll just be a little bit down further once SLIC-P phase 2 is started, and the budgets have been approved and released, and there's a process and tools and methodologies for collecting this. That's when this process will start to take place. The RAN design. So, as I mentioned, one of the principles is it's going to be a very interactive process, a lot of dialogue. FirstNet is looking at a way to kind of phase this in, so release a preliminary design for the states to review, provide feedback on. Then as they get feedback and more information, you start to refine that design, take another look at maybe an intermediate design, and to continue to build into the design until finally you get to a critical design. So a very iterative process, more information, refining this to hopefully get all the state input, and captured and fed into the ultimate design that gets included in the state plan. I mentioned, that there's going to be parallel tracks. So once you have that state design going on, you're also going to have the whole operations side. So to address issues like local control, prioritization, training, security, those were specifically called out in the law, so those will be addressed without a doubt. There will be other issues as well. So all the operational aspects of where, the network operations centers, or how you gain access into the health and monitoring of the network, the user assumptions, all those types of things will be kind of captured in that operations plan, or that operations section or component of the plan. And then finally, this plan is put together. It will identify the funding identified to build up this network. There will be, hopefully, like I said, many opportunities for the states to review everything that's going in, and it goes to the governor for signature. The governor has 90 days to decide if they want to accept the plan. If not, then they have the ability to opt out. We'll talk about that.